"You will move," said the Duke of Pendale, "or I will have you moved." The words fell into the crowded assembly hall like a stone dropped into still water, and every conversation within 10 paces of him faltered and died. Ransomvale, 9th Duke of Pendle, was accustomed to that silence. He had lived inside it the whole of his life, the way another man might live inside a coat cut to his measure. It fit him, and he had ceased to notice it. When he spoke, the world rearranged itself. When he crossed a room, the room made way. So he did not trouble to look at the woman who stood between himself and the tall windows he intended to reach, but only lifted his chin a fraction and waited for the ordinary small miracle of his own authority to occur. It did not occur. The woman did not move. She was of no great height, dressed in a gown of dove-grey silk some seasons out of the current fashion, and she stood with her gloved hands folded before her and her chin level with a composure he found, in the first instant, merely tiresome. He had taken her for a companion, or a poor relation, one of the small grey people who lined the walls of every ball and were forgotten before the music finished. He gave her the second glance he had not intended to give her, the flick of the eye a man spends on an obstacle, and found that she was looking directly back at him. "You may certainly try, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was low and perfectly clear, and it carried not the smallest tremor. "But I was standing here first, and I have not finished admiring the moon through this window, and I do not see why the moon should be less mine than yours." For a moment the Duke of Pendle simply looked at her. He was not a man who was contradicted. He was contradicted so rarely that he had lost the habit of expecting it, and the sensation, when it came, was like the misjudged step at the bottom of a familiar staircase, the foot descending with confidence onto a stair that is not there. His household did not contradict him. His tenants did not contradict him. The great houses of the county emptied their drawing rooms of dispute the moment his name was announced. Even his late father, who had been a hard and unloving man, had spoken to him in the last years with a wariness that resembled deference. And now a grey-gowned woman he did not know, in a provincial assembly he had not wished to attend, was informing him that the moon was hers. "You do not appear to understand who I am," he said. "On the contrary," she answered, "you are the Duke of Pendale." "Half the room has spent the evening telling the other half. I understand precisely who you are. I simply do not agree that it entitles you to my window." Somewhere behind him, a young man laughed, a nervous, disbelieving bark of a laugh, quickly smothered. Pendle did not turn to see who had dared. He was aware, with the part of his mind that was always aware of such things, that the little scene had gathered watchers, that fans had stilled and eyes had slid sideways, that the story would be at every breakfast table in the county by morning. The Duke of Pendle commanded to stand aside by a nobody in grey silk. He felt the old cold arise in him, the anger that had frozen better men than the ones in this room, and he prepared to loose it. And then she smiled. It was not a smile of triumph, nor of mockery, nor of the tremulous appeasement he might have understood and despised. It was a small, private, entirely unafraid smile, as if she found the whole encounter himself include rather more amusing than alarming, and had decided, out of some reserve of good humour he could not fathom, not to make him pay for it. It reached her eyes, which were grey as her gown and quick with intelligence, and it undid his anger the way warm water undoes a knot, loosening what he had meant to pull tight. "There is," she said gently, "a second window. Just there. The view is very nearly as fine, and I promise you the moon is the same size in both." He should have crushed her. He had crushed men for less, had ended a magistrate's career with a sentence, had emptied a ballroom of a family whose daughter had presumed too far. He opened his mouth to do it. "What is your name?" he said instead. She tilted her head, as if the question surprised her more than any of his threats had done. "Marisette Wren," she said, "though I cannot think why it should interest you. I am nobody at all. I keep the accounts and the correspondence for my aunt, Lady Carberry, who is over there by the card tables losing at whist with tremendous enjoyment. And I came to look at the moon because the room is too warm and the conversation is too loud. And you, Your Grace, are the only interesting thing that has happened all evening." She paused. "That is not a compliment. Interesting and pleasant are different qualities. You have a great deal of the one and none at all of the other." The young man behind him laughed again, and this time did not smother it, and Pendle heard, spreading outward from the small circle of listeners, the low, delighted hum of a scandal being born. He turned then, at last, and looked at the room. He looked at it the way a man looks at a landscape from a height, coldly and completely, and the room felt the look and quieted. The delighted hum died. Fans resumed their fluttering with sudden diligence. A dozen conversations sprang into loud, false life. He had reminded them with nothing but his face of who he was, and the reminder had worked on all of them but one. Marasette Wren had already turned back to her window. She had dismissed him. She stood with her hands folded and her grey eyes on the pale disk of the moon above the black line of the trees, and she had, quite simply, finished with him. He was no longer, to her, the most powerful man in 3 counties. He was a person who had wanted her window and been refused it, and having been refused, had become uninteresting. Ransom Vale, 9th Duke of Pendle, went to the second window. He did not go because she had directed him there. He told himself this with some force. He went because the matter was beneath his notice, because a man of his consequence did not brawl over casements with the hired companions of card-playing widows, because the wisest response to insolence was to deny it the dignity of a battle. He went to the second window and stood before it, and looked out at the same moon over the same trees, and found to his considerable irritation that she had been entirely correct. The view was very nearly as fine. The moon was exactly the same size. He stood there a long while. He was aware of her at the other window, a slim grey shape at the edge of his sight, and he was aware that he was aware of her, which was itself unusual, for the Duke of Pendle was not in the habit of noticing where women stood. He turned the encounter over in his mind with the cold, methodical attention he gave to a disputed boundary or a difficult clause, and he could not make it come right. She had refused him. She had refused him and mocked him and dismissed him, and she had done it all without heat, without spite, without the smallest wish to wound, which was the most maddening part of it, for a wound he could have answered. She had simply told him the truth as she saw it and declined to pretend otherwise, and there was nothing in his whole armory of ice and consequence that knew what to do with a person who was not afraid. He left the assembly within the half-hour. He did not take his leave of his hostess, who fluttered after him to the door with anxious apologies she did not understand the need for. He did not look again at the window, but as his carriage rolled home through the dark lanes, the lamps swinging their yellow light across the hedgerows, he found that he was not thinking of the tenancy dispute that had brought him into the county, nor of the letter he must write to Steward, nor of any of the 1,000 cold concerns that ordinarily filled the machinery of his mind. He was thinking that the moon was the same size in both windows. He was thinking that she had said so, and had been right. Pendle Hall stood upon a rise of ground above its own valley, grey and enormous and cold, a house built by a Vale 2 centuries before to intimidate the county and never yet repaired to comfort those who lived in it. The Duke had grown up in its long galleries and colder rooms, the only son of a father who had regarded affection as a weakness to be trained out of a boy as one trains a fault out of a horse, with the whip and the withheld word. His mother he barely remembered. She had died when he was 6, and his father had spoken of her afterward with a contempt that the boy, not understanding, had learned to imitate. He had learned early that to want a thing openly was to give another person the power to deny it to you, that the safest wanting was no wanting at all, that a man who needed nothing could not be hurt. He had made himself into such a man. He had done it so thoroughly that by the age of 9 and 30 he had almost forgotten it was a thing he had done, and mistook the armor for the body beneath. He commanded. It was the one thing he knew how to do. Commanded servants and stewards and solicitors and the whole apparatus of a great estate, and it obeyed him, and in the obedience he found something that was not happiness, for he did not believe in happiness, but was at least order, and order he could trust. He gave a command and the world became, for a moment, exactly as he had willed it, and in that moment the cold house on the hill was almost bearable. Now a woman had refused a command, and he could not stop thinking of it. He learned, without appearing to seek the knowledge, a little more about her over the following days. It was not difficult. The county could talk of nothing else. Marasette Wren was the orphan daughter of a clergyman of good family and no fortune, taken in some years past by her aunt, the widowed Lady Carberry, less as a niece than as an unpaid secretary and companion. She had, it was said, a shocking habit of speaking her mind. She had refused 2 respectable offers of marriage on the grounds that the gentleman bored her, which the county considered near madness in a woman with no money and no prospects. She read a great deal. She was 27, which in the reckoning of that world made her very nearly past praying for. She was, in short, exactly the kind of woman the world had agreed to overlook, and she appeared not to have noticed that she had been overlooked, or having noticed, not to mind. The Duke of Pendal minded. He did not know why. He told himself he did not think of her, and thought of her at unguarded moments when the moon rose over his own black line of trees, when a servant hesitated too long before obeying, and he found himself, absurdly, almost wishing the man would refuse. He had ordered his whole life so that no one might affect him, and a woman in grey silk had affected him with a single sentence about a window, and he resented her for it with a heat that was itself a kind of thinking of her, though he would not have admitted so. It was Lady Carberry's misfortune, or her fortune, to hold a tenancy on the very edge of the Pendale lands, a small property, a matter of a few fields and a stone farmhouse and a wood, that had come to her through her late husband and marched along the boundary of the Duke's western holdings. And it was the Duke's steward, a dry and careful man named Fenwick, who brought to his master's attention some 3 weeks after the assembly that the boundary of that very property was in dispute, that Lady Carberry's people had been taking timber from a wood the estate maps showed to be the Duke's, and that the matter, if his Grace wished, might be pressed. "Press it," said the Duke of Pendal, and turned back to his correspondence. Then he set down his pen. "No," he said, "I will call on Lady Carberry myself." Fenwick, who had served 3 dukes and knew better than to show surprise, permitted himself one lifted eyebrow at the closing door. Carberry Grange was a modest house of weathered stone set among untidy gardens, the sort of place that had once been prosperous and was now merely genteel, kept up by careful economy and pride. The Duke of Pendal arrived at 11 in the morning in a plain travelling coach, without the outriders and blazoned panels he might have brought, and this small omission was itself a kind of dishonesty he did not examine, for a man calling to press a boundary dispute has no need to spare his opponent's nerves. He was shown into a shabby, sunny morning room by a maid who could not stop staring, and there he was made to wait, which he was not accustomed to, and while he waited he discovered for the door to the adjoining room stood ajar that he could hear voices. "And I tell you the man is a tyrant," said Lady Carberry's voice, high and querulous. "He will take the wood and the fields and the roof over our heads if it pleases him, and there is not a magistrate in the county who dares tell him no. We are ruined, Mariset. We shall have to sell, and go and live in a hired room in Bath and drink the waters and pretend it is a treat." "We shall do nothing of the kind," said the other voice, and the Duke's whole attention narrowed to it. It was her voice, low and clear and steady, and it carried the same unhurried certainty it had carried at the window. "The wood was granted to my uncle by the 7th Duke, in writing, and I have the paper. I found it a fortnight ago in the muniment chest, folded inside a sermon of my father's, which is precisely where no one thought to look. It is signed and it is sealed and it is perfectly plain. His Grace may bluster as he likes. He may frown at us in the manner that has apparently frightened 3 counties into fits, but he cannot take what is ours by law, and I intend to tell him so to his face, and I intend to enjoy it." "You cannot speak so to a duke," moaned Lady Carberry. "I have spoken so to a duke," said Mariset Wren, "and found it agreed with me remarkably. Now dry your eyes, aunt, and put on your good cap, and let us go and be tyrannized in comfort." The Duke of Pendal stood in the sunny room with a most peculiar sensation moving through him, and it was some moments before he identified it, because he had felt it so seldom. He wished to laugh. Not the cold bark that passed with him for amusement, the sound he made when a rival stumbled, but a real and unexpected warmth rising under the ribs at the picture of this penniless woman folding a legal weapon inside Ed clergyman's sermon and waiting, with relish, to fire it at him. He mastered the impulse. He arranged his face into the still-cold mask it wore by habit, but when the 2 women came in, the aunt fluttering and apologetic, the niece composed and grey-eyed and carrying, he noted, a folded paper in her hand, he found the mask harder to hold than usual. "Your Grace," said Lady Carberry, sinking into a curtsy of abject terror, "you do us such honour. Such very great honor. We are, that is, I am sure, any misunderstanding about the wood. There has been no misunderstanding, said Marisette Wren, on our side. She curtsied too, but it was the smallest curtsy the forms permitted, an economical dip that granted him his rank and not a hair's breadth more, and she rose from it looking him full in the face. She was not afraid. He had come here half expecting, he realized, to find that the woman at the window had been a fever of the evening, a thing of candlelight and champagne that would evaporate in the plain sun, that she would prove in the morning and in her own shabby room to be as frightened of him as everyone else. She was not. She stood in her worn morn gown with her chin level and her paper in her hand, and she was more herself in the daylight than she had been by the moon, and the sight of it did something to his chest that he had no name for and did not like. "You have come about the wood," she said. "I have." "Then you have had a wasted journey, your grace, and I am sorry for it, though not very. The wood is ours. It was granted to my late uncle by your grandfather, the 7th Duke, by a deed signed in his own hand and sealed with the Pendale seal, in consideration of a service my uncle rendered him, which the deed does not name, but which I have reason to believe involved a great deal of discretion and a young lady who was not the 7th Duke's wife. Here is the deed." She held it out. "You may examine it. I have a fair copy lodged with an attorney in the town, so there is no purpose in your putting the original in the fire, which is what I should do in your place, and I do not think highly of your place." Lady Carberry made a small strangled sound. The Duke of Pendale took the paper. He read it. It was, as she had said, perfectly plain, the crabbed hand of the estate clerk of 40 years gone, the 7th Duke's own signature, the wax seal cracked but whole. It granted the wood and its timber and the fields adjoining in perpetuity to one Josiah Carberry and his heirs, and there was no ambiguity in it anywhere. Fenwick's maps were wrong, or had been quietly corrected by some later steward who had hoped the paper lost. He was, in the plain language of law, entirely without a case. He might still have pressed it. That was the thing she did not understand about him, or perhaps understood too well. He might have taken the dispute to a court where his money and his name would outlast her attorneys, might have ground the small property to dust in fees and delays until the aunt sold in despair and the deed became a curiosity. It was what his father would have done. It was, an hour before, what he had half intended. Men did not defeat the Duke of Pendale by being in the right. Being in the right was a small thing easily buried. He folded the paper and gave it back to her. "The wood is yours," he said. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the silences he was used to. Lady Carberry gaped, and Marisette Wren, for the first time since he had met her, looked genuinely surprised, not frightened, not gratified, but honestly taken aback, as though a piece of furniture she had expected to remain furniture had risen and said something to the point. "That is remarkably reasonable of you," she said slowly, "and I confess I did not think you had it in you. You will find," said the Duke of Pendale, "that I have a great many things in me that you have not thought to look for." He had not meant to say it. It had come out of him unbidden, low, with an undertow he had not intended, and he saw her hear the undertow, saw her grey eyes flicker over his face with sudden careful attention, as if she were revising, in that instant, some settled estimate. Colour came up under her fair skin, not much, a faint warmth along the cheekbone, and she looked away from toward the window, where the sun lay across the untidy garden. "That may be so," she said, "though I should warn you, your grace, I am not easily persuaded of a man's hidden depths. I have known a great many men who claimed them, and found the depth to be about the depth of a saucer, and full of themselves." She turned back to him. "Why did you truly come? You could have sent your attorney. You could have sent Fenwick. A duke does not put on a plain coat and drive out to a shabby grange to give away a wood he might have taken. Do not tell me it was justice. I do not think justice has ever once inconvenienced you before this morning." He looked at her. He was aware of the aunt in the corner, of the maid hovering with a forgotten tray, of the whole shabby sunny room, and he was aware, more than any of it, of the plain question in her grey eyes, which no one in 20 years had dared to put to him. "Why are you truly here?" And he found, to his own astonishment, that he did not know the answer, or knew it and could not say it, for the answer had something to do with a window and a moon and the intolerable, magnetic fact of a person who would not be afraid of him, and he had no words for such things. He had been given no words for such things. His father had trained the words out of him along with the wanting. "I do not account for my movements," he said, and heard how cold it sounded, how it slammed shut the small warm door that had, for a moment, stood open between them. Something in her face closed too. Not into fear, she did not seem to own the thing, but into a cool, amused disappointment, the look of a woman who has been shown a promising book and found the pages blank. "No," she said, "I don't suppose you do. You have your answer and I have my wood, and I am sure we are both very satisfied. Sarah will show you out." She curtsied the small curtsy again. "Good morning, Your Grace. Thank you for the wood. It was almost worth the fright you gave my aunt." He was dismissed. For the second time in a month, this woman had finished with him and turned away, and there was nothing left for him to do but go. He inclined his head, the fraction of a bow he gave to equals and never to dependents, and he did not notice he had given it until he was in his coach again, rolling back between the hedgerows toward his cold house on the hill. "You have a great deal of the one and none at all of the other. I do not think highly of your place, the depth of a saucer, and full of themselves." He should have been enraged. He catalogued, coldly, the insults she had offered him, and found that he could not summon the rage they merited, and found instead that he was turning each one over like a coin, examining it, half admiring the mint of it. No one spoke to him so. No one had ever spoken to him so. And the trouble, he saw it clearly now, in the swaying dimness of the coach, was that he did not want her to stop. He wanted to go back to the shabby Grange and be told again, precisely and without fear, exactly what was wrong with him. He wanted to stand in a sunny room and be defeated by a folded deed and made to give up a wood, and to see the honest surprise in her grey eyes when he did the decent thing, as though decency from him were a small daily miracle she had not expected to witness. He had wanted very little for a very long time. He had made himself want nothing, because wanting was weakness and weakness was danger, and his father had beaten the lesson into his bones. And now at 39, in a swaying coach on a country road, the Duke of Pendle discovered that he wanted something after all, and that the something was a penniless clergyman's daughter of 27, who thought him arrogant and cold and shallow as a saucer, and who was, on the whole of the evidence, correct. The discovery did not make him gentle. It would be pleasant to say that it did, that the sight of her softened him at once, that he drove home a better man. But he had been made hard over 39 years, and a man is not remade in a coach. The discovery rather made him angry at her for causing it, at himself for feeling it, at the whole intolerable disorder of caring what a nobody thought of him, and a Vale, faced with a disorder, reached by instinct for command. He would order the thing back into its box. He would call on Lady Carberry again, on some pretext, and this time he would be so cold and so consequential that the niece would be put in her place at last, and the strange warm door would be shut and locked, and he would be free of her. He told his coachman to turn about. He did not, in the end, turn about that day. Even a Vale could see the absurdity of driving up twice in one morning. But he began, from that hour, to find reasons. There is always a reason for a man with an estate the size of 3 parishes to be seen near Carberry Grange, a boundary to inspect, a cottage to visit, a road to ride down that led, if a man were not careful, past a certain untidy garden, and Marisette Wren, going about her small daily business of accounts and errands and her aunt's endless needs, began to find the Duke of Pendle appearing at the edges of her days with a frequency that a less intelligent woman might have called coincidence, and that she, being who she was, called by its right name almost at once, and found intolerable, and told him so. The days after the granting of the wood did not, as a wiser man might have hoped, restore the Duke of Pendle to his former order. They unsettled it further. He returned to his cold house on the hill and took up his correspondence and his ledgers and the 1,000 small tyrannies of a great estate. And he found that the machinery of his life, which had run so smoothly for so long, had developed a fault he could not locate and could not mend, and the fault, he was slowly forced to admit, was that a part of his mind had gone to a shabby Grange in the valley and declined to come back. He caught himself at it a dozen times a day. He would be dictating a letter to Fenwick, and the sentence would fail on his tongue, because he had begun, without meaning to compose a reply to something Marisette Wren had said, a rejoinder to an argument she had not made, a defense against a criticism she had not yet uttered, but that he somehow knew she would utter if she saw the way he ran his lands. He would ride out to inspect a drainage or a fence and find that his horse had carried him, by a route he had not chosen, to the top of the rise from which the roof of Carberry Grange was just visible among its untiddy trees, and he would sit there in the cold like a schoolboy and despise himself and not move. It was intolerable. He had spent his whole life making himself proof against exactly this, against the tyranny of wanting, against the humiliation of a mind that would not obey its owner, and a woman with a basket had breached the whole defense with a sentence about a window. He tried, in the first weeks, to cure himself by contempt. He reminded himself of what she was, a nobody, a dependent, a spinster of 27 with a sharp tongue and no fortune and no beauty that the county would have called beauty, a woman the world had rightly overlooked. He assembled the case against her with a lawyer's care, and every clause of it collapsed the moment he brought her face to mind, because the world had overlooked her the way a man hurrying through a gallery overlooks the one true painting among the copies, not because it is lesser, but because he has not the eye to see it, and the fault is in the eye and not the painting. He had the eye now. That was the trouble. He had looked at her, really looked, and having looked he could not unsee, and the whole county of comfortable overlooking was close to him forever. He saw her everywhere. He saw her in the faces of the servants who feared him, and understood for the first time that their fear was not respect. He saw her in the cold correct letters his solicitors sent, and heard how she would have mocked their pomp. He saw her, worst of all, in the long mirror in his dressing room, in his own cold face, and heard her voice saying, "You have a great deal of the one and none at all of the other," and could not, for the life of him, decide that she had been wrong. A lesser vanity would have hated her for it. His did a little. There is always hatred at the bottom of a wounded pride, but underneath the hatred, growing where the hatred could not reach, was something the Duke of Pendle had not felt since he was a boy, before his father broke it out at him. Wonder. The simple, astonished pull toward a person who was not like anyone he had ever met, who did not want anything from him, who was not afraid, who had looked at the most powerful man in 3 counties and seen, quite clearly, a lonely one. He wanted to know what she thought. About everything. He wanted to bring her his cold, ordered life and set it before her grey, unflinching eyes and hear her tell him, without mercy and without flattery, exactly what was wrong with it. No one had ever offered to tell him what was wrong with anything. The whole world had spent 39 years telling him he was right, and he was starving, he realized, starving for the one voice that would tell him he was not. So he went back to the lane. He told himself each time that it was a state business, and each time the fiction wore thinner. And on the 3rd time she stopped him in the muddy road with her basket on her arm, and made him say the truth out loud, and after that there was no more pretending, for either of them, though a great deal of arguing yet remained. It was in those first weeks, too, that he began to understand the shape of her life, and to be ashamed of the ease of his own. She was up before the servants. He learned the Grange kept only a maid and a manservant now. The establishment pared to the bone by Lady Carberry's dwindling means, and it was Maraset who ordered the small household, kept its accounts to the farthing, wrote her aunt's letters and paid her aunt's bills and soothed her aunt's endless nervous complaints, managed the little farm that kept them from actual want, and did it all with a competence and a good humour that would have run a duchy. She had the mind of a steward and the patience of a saint and the fortune of a beggar, and the world, seeing only the beggar, had never troubled to notice the rest. The Duke of Pendle, who commanded 100 servants to do less than she did alone, noticed. And the noticing shamed him, in a place he had thought past shaming, and the shame was, though he did not yet know it, the first honest feeling he had permitted himself in 30 years, and the beginning of everything that came after. "You are following me," she said. It was a bright cold morning some 10 days later, and she had come out along the lane that led from the Grange to the village with a basket over her arm and a list of her aunt's errands in her head, and there, sitting his great black horse at the crossroads as though he had grown there, was the Duke of Pendle. He had contrived to make the meeting seem accidental 3 times already that fortnight, and she had let 2 of them pass in cool civility, and now, on the 3rd, She had evidently decided that civility had done its work and honesty might have a turn. "I am inspecting my lands," said the Duke. "You are inspecting Lady Carberry's lane," said Marisette Wren, "which is not your land and never has been, and along which there is nothing to inspect but a hedge, a puddle, and myself. I do not flatter myself that it is the hedge that draws you, and I have seen the puddle disappoint better men. So I am forced to conclude, Your Grace, that it is myself, and I should like to know why, because it is beginning to be remarked upon, and a poor woman's reputation is the only property she owns outright, and I do not care to have it damaged by a duke who is bored." He looked down at her from the height of his horse. The morning light was hard and clear on both their faces, and it hid nothing, not the fine cold structure of his, nor the level challenge of hers, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the hedge and the puddle and the cold blue sky held them in a small taut silence. "You presume a great deal," he said, "for a woman with a basket." "I presume exactly as much as the evidence permits," she said, "no more. If you have a lawful reason to haunt this lane, name it, and I will beg your pardon and go on to the village. If you have not, then you are a great man idling away his mornings under a poor woman's window, and you are making her the talk of the ale-house, and I will thank you to stop." She shifted the basket on her arm. "There, I have said it plainly. You may be as offended as you like. I find that people who are offended by plain speech are generally people who have something to hide from it." He dismounted. She had not expected that. He saw her not expect it. He came down off the tall horse and stood before her in the lane. Without the horse's height between them, he was only a man, a tall and cold and finely made man, and rather closer to her than the lane strictly required. The mask was on his face. But behind the mask something was working, and she watched it work with her grey unflinching eyes. "You wish me to name a reason," he said. "I wish you to name the true one," she said, "or none." "Then none," said the Duke of Pendale, "for I do not have a name for it. I am not in the habit of examining why I do what I do. I do it, and the world adjusts. I came to this lane the first time by accident, and the second time by design, and the third time—" He stopped. She had gone very still. "The third time," he said, "because I could not keep away, and I do not understand it, and I do not like it, and I would give a great deal to be rid of it, and I cannot. There, you wanted plain speech. That is as plain as I have ever spoken to any living soul, and I resent you for drawing it out of me, and I would resent you less if you were not so infernally right about everything, including the puddle." The silence after this was different again. A bird sang somewhere in the hard bright hedge. Marisette Wren stood with her basket on her arm and her cheeks flushed with more than the cold, and she looked at the Duke of Pendale as though she were seeing, for the first time, the shape of the man inside the reputation, and did not quite know what to make of the shape, but was no longer looking away from it. "That," she said at last, "is the most honest thing you have ever said to me. It is also, I think, the most honest thing you have said to anyone in a very long time, and it appears to have cost you something like the extraction of a tooth." "It has." "Good," she said. "Pain is instructive." But she said it more gently than her words, and the gentleness undid him further than any softness would have done. "Your Grace, I am going to be very frank with you, because I do not think anyone else in your life is, and I have concluded that you are lonelier for the want of it than a man of your fortune has any right to be. You are used to command. You give an order and the world obeys, and you have mistaken the obedience for regard, and now that you have met a person who will not obey you, you have mistaken your confusion, for I do not know what you have mistaken it for. But you cannot command me, and you cannot command my good opinion, and if you go on trying to purchase or frighten or overawe your way into it, you will fail, and you will deserve to fail, and you will be exactly as unhappy as you have made yourself already." She paused. "If you want my regard, and I begin to think, absurdly, that you do, there is only one way to it, and it is the way no one has ever made you take. You must earn it. You must be, to me and to the people who depend on you, better than you have troubled to be, not because I command it, which I cannot, but because it is right, which you have always known and never once cared for. And it will be slow, and it will be uncomfortable, and there is no guarantee at the end of it, for I am not a wood to be granted, and I will not be given as a reward for good behavior. Do you understand me?" He understood her. That was the terrible part. In the whole of his life, no one had ever told him he might have to earn a thing he wanted. Everything had been his by right, by rank, by force, and the getting of it had never once required him to become worthy of it. And this woman was standing in a muddy lane with a basket of her aunt's errands and telling him that the one thing he had discovered he wanted could not be seized, could not be bought, could not be commanded, but must be earned. Slowly and uncertainly, and at the cost of remaking himself, and that even then she might refuse him at the end. It was the most exorbitant price anything had ever carried. It was also, he understood with a strange lurch, the first thing in his life that had ever seemed to him worth its price. "I understand you," he said. "Then we understand each other," she said, "which is more than I hoped for this morning. Now I must go to the village, because my aunt wants tea and thread and a great many things I have forgotten, and you must go and inspect some land that is actually yours. Good morning, Your Grace." And she dropped him the small economical curtsy and turned, and walked away up the lane toward the village with her basket on her arm, not once looking back, and the Duke of Pendal stood beside his great black horse and watched her go, and did not command her to stop. And it was the hardest thing he had ever not done. He did not know how to earn a thing. No one had taught him. He had been taught to take and to hold, and to frighten off the taking of others, and the whole grammar of earning, of giving, of serving, of making oneself of use was a language he had never learned to speak. So he began that winter in the only way he knew, which was clumsily and coldly, and with the arrogance still thick upon him, so that his first attempts to be better looked, from the outside, very like his old attempts to command. He sent, the day after the lane, a cartload of coal to Carberry Grange, and a case of wine, and a haunch of venison, with a curt note that they were owed on the boundary or some such fiction, and Marisette sent the whole of it back, with a note of her own. "Your Grace," she wrote, in a small firm hand, "we are poor, but we are not paupers, and a woman who can be fed is a woman who can be bought, and I have already told you I am not for sale. If you wish to do good in this valley, there are families along the river who lost their roofs in the autumn floods, and have had no help from the great house on the hill, though the great house owns their cottages and takes their rent. Begin with them. Do not begin with me. When I am cold this winter, I shall think of the mending you have done to their roofs, and it will warm me better than your coal." M.W. He read the note 4 times. Then he sent for Fenwick, and asked him whether it was true that tenants along the river had lost their roofs in the floods. And Fenwick, after a wary pause, allowed that it was, and that the estate had done nothing, because his Grace had given no order, and one did not spend the estate's money mending cottages without an order. "You will mend them now," said the Duke of Pendal, "every one, before the hard frosts. And you will not put the cost against the tenants' rents." And Fenwick, the steward, turned at the door. "Why did you not tell me?" Fenwick looked at his master with the carefully blank face of a man who has served the Vales a long time, and knows exactly why he had not told him. "Your Grace has never before wished to be told such things," he said. "Your Grace has been chiefly concerned with what the estate yields, and not with what it costs the people who make it yield. I did not think it my place to trouble you with roofs." It was in its dry way, as plain rebuke as Marisette's had been, and it landed harder for coming from a servant who had feared him for a decade and clearly feared him still. The Duke of Pendal stood in his cold study and understood that he had built around himself a whole household of people who did not tell him the truth because he had punished the truth every time it inconvenienced him. That Marisette Wren was not an aberration, but a glimpse of what every one of them might have said, had he ever once made it safe to say it. He had thought himself a strong man surrounded by weak ones. He saw for a moment that he might rather be a frightened man surrounded by frightened ones, and that he had done the frightening himself. The roofs were mended before the hard frosts. He rode down to the river himself to see it done, not to be thanked, for the families were too afraid of him to thank him, but simply to see it, to stand in the cold with the smell of new thatch and mortar and watch a thing his order had made better instead of worse. It was a small strange feeling, and did not have a name for it either. It was not the satisfaction of command. It was something quieter and warmer and more durable, and it lived, he found, in the same unfamiliar country of the chest where the wanting of her lived, and he began that winter to suspect that the two were the same country, and that he had been exiled from it his whole life and had only lately learned it was there. He did not tell Marisette that the roofs were mended. He found he did not want to tell her, in the old way, as a man lays a trophy at a woman's feet to be rewarded for it. He wanted her to hear of it from someone else, by chance, and to know that he had done it because it was right, and not because she had commanded it, since she had told him she would command nothing and be bought with nothing. And in this, too, he was learning her language, though he did not yet know that he was, learning that the way to her regard ran through actions she never saw, and that a good thing done in secret weighed more with her than 100 done in view. She heard of it, of course. The valley was small and the alehouse was thorough, and within a fortnight it was known everywhere that the Duke had mended the river cottages at his own cost and struck nothing from the rents, and the valley did not know what to make of it, and neither, when the news reached her, did Marisette Wren. She stood in the shabby morning room with the report on her lips, brought in by the maid, and she looked out the window toward the grey house on the hill for a long time, and said nothing, and her aunt, watching her, thought she had never seen her niece look so uncertain of anything in her life. There was a particular quarrel, in the heart of that winter, that the Duke of Pendale would count afterward as the true turning of his life, though at the time it seemed one more of the arguments that had become the strange sustenance of his days. He had come to the Grange with a book he had taken to bringing her books, having discovered that they hungered for reading and could not afford to buy it, and that a gift of a book, unlike a gift of coal, was a gift she would accept, because a book fed the mind and not the pride. And she had made him understand the difference. This book was one he had read himself and thought fine, a treatise by a great man of the age upon the proper ordering of society, in which it was argued with much elegance that every man was born to his station, and that the good of all was best served when each kept to the place appointed him, the high commanding and the low obeying, as the natural order of a well-run world. He had brought it to her, he confessed to himself, half in the secret hope that it would put her in her place, that the wisdom of a great man would say, in cold print, what he had not the words to say, that she was a nobody and he a duke, and the gulf between them was fixed by nature, and no fault of his to bridge. She read it in 3 days, and gave it back to him with a look he had learned to dread and to relish in equal measure. "It is very elegantly written," she said, "and it is wrong from the first page to the last, and I am surprised at you, your grace, for thinking it fine. Though I suppose I ought not to be, for it flatters exactly the men who are already comfortable, and there is no argument so easily believed as the one that tells you that your good fortune is a law of nature, and your neighbour's misery is his own fault for being born to it." "It is the wisdom of the age," said the Duke. "It is the excuse of the age," said Marisette Wren, dressed up in fine clothes, which is a thing the age is very good at. "Sit down, your grace, and I will tell you what is wrong with it, for you have plainly never heard it argued with. And a man who has never heard his favourite ideas argued with is a man who has never really thought them at all, but only inherited them like his acres." And she sat him down by the fire, and she took his fine book apart, chapter by chapter, with a clarity and a fire and a plain human fury that he had never once encountered in all the elegant drawing-rooms of his life. She spoke of the families along the river whose roofs had rotted while the great house took their rent, of the children in the valley who would never learn their letters because no one thought a labourer's child worth the teaching, of her own father, a gentleman and a scholar, dead poor because he had chosen his conscience over a rich living, and of herself, his daughter, sharp as any man in that treatise's pages, and shut out of every use her mind might have made of the world for the single crime of being born a woman without a fortune. She did not spare him. She told him that his station was not a law of nature, but an accident of birth, that he had done nothing to earn his acres, but begot by a duke upon a duchess, that the same God who had made him high had made the drowned families low, and that if there was a natural order in it, it was one that no just man could look at squarely and defend, and that he had never looked at it squarely because he had never once had to, and that this was the true privilege of his rank, not the acres, not the coronet, but the luxury of never being made to see. He had come to put her in her place. He left that evening with the whole foundation of his life cracked beneath him, for he could not answer her, that was the terrible, exhilarating fact of it, he could not answer her, and he had never in his life met a thing he could not answer, and he found, riding home through the dark, that he did not want to answer her. He wanted her to be right. Some starved honest thing in him that his father had never quite killed leapt up to meet her fury and said, "Ah, yes, this is true. You have always known it was true." And the wall shook, and a stone came loose, and he rode home a smaller and a larger man than he had left. "You did not defend your book," she observed the next time he came. She said it almost gently, watching his face. "I could not," he said. "You were right, and I have never in my life let anyone be right against me, and I find it is not the humiliation I expected. It is more like," he searched for it, "like setting down a weight I did not know I carried. I have spent 39 years being right, madam, and it has made me a cold and lonely man, and you are the first person who ever cared enough to tell me I was wrong. And I begin to think that being told one is wrong, by a person who tells it out of care, and not out of malice, is one of the great neglected kindnesses of the world, and that I have been starved of it, and that I am greedy for more." Marisette Wren looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her grey eyes, some final reservation giving way, and when she spoke her voice had lost the last of its cool amusement and found something graver and warmer beneath. "Do you know, Your Grace," she said, "I believe that maybe the moment I stopped studying you as a problem and started—" She stopped, and colour came into her face, and she looked into the fire rather than at him. "Never mind what I started. It is too soon to say it, and I am not a woman who says things before their time. But you have surprised me, Ransom Vale. I did not think you had it in you to be told you were wrong and thank the teller for it. Most men would rather be damned. It is, I think, the rarest thing I have ever seen in a proud man, and it has quite undone all my careful low opinion of you, and I shall have to build a new one, and I am afraid it will be a good deal harder to keep." And she smiled at him then. The small, private, unafraid smile she had smiled at a window in the autumn, and this time it was not a wall she raised with it but a door she opened, and the Duke of Pendale walked through it, at last, into the warm. The winter deepened, and with it, so slowly that neither of them could have named the day it began, something changed between the grey house on the hill and the shabby grange in the valley. He did not send coal again, he learned, when Lady Carberry's roof sprang a leak in the January storms. He did not send men to mend it, which would have been charity and would have been refused. Instead he mentioned to the vicar, who mentioned it to Lady Carberry, that a good slater in the town was owed a favour by the estate and might be had cheaply. And the leak was mended for a sum the Grange could afford, and no one but the Duke knew that the sum was a tenth of the work's true worth, and the estate had quietly paid the rest. He learned to give without the giving being seen. It went against every instinct he owned, for a Vale gave nothing without the world knowing the giver, but he was learning her, and she had taught him that the finest gifts are the ones that leave the taker's pride whole. And he began to call at the Grange openly, in daylight, in his own name without pretext. The first time Lady Carberry nearly fainted. By the fourth or fifth, she had recovered enough to flutter and offer weak tea and thin bread and butter, which the Duke of Pendale, who dined off gold, ate as though it were a banquet, because it was Marisette who buttered it. And Marisette received him with a cool amusement that never quite warmed into welcome and never quite cooled into dismissal, and she argued with him. That was the heart of it. She argued with him. No one had ever argued with the Duke of Pendale. The whole world had spent 39 years agreeing with him or fleeing him, and he had never known, until a shabby morning room in a country winter, the particular pleasure of a mind that met his own and gave no ground. They argued about everything. They argued about the management of estates and the education of the poor, and whether a man was made by his blood or his choices. They argued about books, of which she had read a great many, and he, to his surprise, discovered he wished to read more, if only to have more to argue about. They argued about the war and the harvest, and whether the moon was more beautiful full or on the wane. She was often right and never gracious about being right, and he was sometimes right and learned, slowly, painfully, that being right was worth less than he had thought, and being kind was worth more, and that she valued the second far above the first, and that this, too, was a thing his father had got exactly backward. "You are not so cold as they say," she told him one afternoon, over the thin bread and butter, when the light was failing early and the fire had burned low, and her aunt had fallen asleep in her chair by the hearth. Or rather, you are exactly as cold as they say, but it is not the whole of you. It is a wall, and behind the wall there is a man who is not cold at all, and who is, think, rather starved, and who has spent so long being a wall that he has half forgotten he is a man. I used to think you were arrogant to the bone. I have revised it. I think you are arrogant to about the depth of a wall, and behind the wall you are something else entirely, and I cannot decide whether it is worth the trouble of climbing over to find out. And how, said the Duke of Pendal, does one climb over such a wall? She looked at him. The firelight was low and gold on her face, and her aunt slept, and the winter dusk pressed blue against the windows, and something in the room had grown quiet and close and dangerous. One does not climb it, she said softly. One waits, I think, for the man behind it to take it down himself, a stone at a time, of his own will, because he has decided he would rather be seen than safe. It cannot be done from the outside. I have tried. Everyone who ever loved you has tried, I expect, and been kept out and given up. The wall has to come down from within, or it does not come down at all. She looked into the fire. I do not know whether you will take it down. I do not think you know either. But I have watched you these 3 months, your grace, mending roofs you thought no one saw, and eating my aunt's dreadful bread as though you loved it, and I have begun to think against my better judgment, which is usually excellent, that perhaps you might. He did not answer her at once. He sat in the failing light with the low fire between them and the old woman sleeping, and he felt the wall she spoke of, felt it as a real thing, cold and high and old, built stone by a frightened boy in a cold house to keep out a father's contempt. Felt how much of his life had been lived behind it, and how safe it was and how alone, and he understood that she was right, that no one could take it down for him, that she would not even try, that she was offering him not a rescue, but a choice, and that the choice was his and would always be his. And that she would love him, if she loved him at all, only on the far side of it, only if he chose to be seen. When I was a boy, he heard himself say, my father broke my arm. She went very still, not in anger, he said. That is the part I have never told anyone. Anger I might have, there is a kind of love that runs mad and strikes, and is sorry after. This was not that. I had wept over some small thing, a dead dog, I think, and he did not like weeping, and he took my arm and he broke it across his knee the way a man breaks kindling, coldly, deliberately, to teach me. And he said, I remember it exactly, I have remembered it every day of my life, he said, there. Now you have something to weep for, weep quietly. And I did, I wept quietly. I have wept quietly ever since, if I have wept at all, which is seldom. I learned that day that to feel a thing was to hand another man a stick to beat you with, and that the only safety was to feel nothing and want nothing and let no one in, ever, behind the wall. And I built the wall, and it kept out the sticks, and it kept out everything else besides, and I have lived behind it for 33 years, and I did not know it was lonely until you told me the moon was yours, and I could not stop wanting to stand at your window. He stopped. His voice, he found, was not quite steady, and he did not try to steady it, and that unsteadiness was itself a stone come loose. I am telling you this, he said, because you said the wall must come down from within. This is a stone. It is the first stone I have ever handed to anyone. I do not know how many there are. I do not know if I can reach them all. But I would rather try and fail, and be seen failing by you, than stand safe behind the wall for the rest of my life and be the man they think I am. That is the truest thing I know how to say. Marisette Wren sat in the firelight with her hands folded in her lap and her grey eyes bright with something that was not quite tears and not quite not, and for a long moment she did not speak, and the fire settled and the old woman slept, and the blue dusk deepened at the windows. Ransom, she said, and it was the first time she had used his name, the first time anyone in years had used his given name at all, and it went through him like warmth through cold hands. That was very well done. That was worth more than every roof in the valley. Do you know, I think that was the bravest thing I have ever heard a man say, and you said it in a shabby room to a woman who has nothing and can give you nothing, which makes it braver still, because you cannot have said it to be rewarded. There is no reward here. There is only me and my terrible aunt, and thin bread and butter, and a wood you gave away. There is you, he said. That is the whole of the reward. It is a great deal more than I have ever been offered. She looked at him a long moment. Then she rose and crossed the small space between them and stood before his chair. And after a hesitation that was itself unlike her, for she was never uncertain, she reached out and laid her hand very lightly against the side of his face. It was the first time she had touched him. Her hand was warm and small and roughened a little by the work she did, and he turned his cheek into it the way a man turns toward a fire he has been too long away from, and closed his eyes, and for a moment the cold Duke Pendal, who had frightened 3 counties, sat with his eyes shut and a poor woman's hand against his face, and did not command anything at all, and wanted nothing in the world but for the moment not to end. "Well," said Marisette softly, and there was a roughness in her voice too now. "Here is a stone I will hand you in return, since we are handing stones. I did not want to love you. I thought you were everything I despise, proud and cold and cruel by habit, a man who mistook fear for love and command for worth. And I told myself, when you kept appearing in my lane, that I was only amused, that I was studying you the way one studies a hard problem, that when the winter ended I would go on with my small life, and think of the strange cold Duke as a curiosity, and it is not true. It has not been true for weeks. I love you, Ransom, God help me, and it is the most inconvenient thing that has ever happened to me, and I am furious about it, and I would not undo it for the world." She took her hand from his face, but slowly, as though it cost her. "There. Now we have both said the thing that cannot be unsaid, and there is no wall left standing between us at all, and I have no idea what happens next, and for the first time in my life I find I do not mind not knowing." There was one afternoon in that thawing winter that the Duke of Pendal kept, ever after, folded in the private place where he kept the few true things of his life, and took out sometimes in the years to come to look at, as a man looks at a first coin of a fortune. It had snowed in the night, the first real snow of the year, and the valley lay white and hushed under a low grey sky, and he had driven down to the Grange in a light sleigh because the lanes were choked and no wheel could pass. He had not sent word. He never sent word now. And Marisette never seemed to expect it, and never seemed put out, which he had at first mistaken for indifference, and had slowly learned to read as a kind of ease. She did not perform for his coming, did not scramble to receive him, but let him find her as she was, which was itself a form of trust he had not known he craved. He found her that day in the small cold kitchen garden behind the Grange, wrapped in a shawl the colour of old moss, on her knees in the snow, doing something incomprehensible to a row of buried roots. "You will freeze," he said from the gate. "I am seeing whether the parsnips have survived the frost," she said, not looking up. "They are sweeter after a frost. If the frost does not go too deep, it is a great deal like people, I have found. A little hardship improves the flavour. Too much and the thing is ruined past use." She sat back on her heels and looked at him then, her cheeks bright with cold, snow on the moss-green shawl, and something in his chest turned over. "You are staring, your grace. It is very rude. Did no one ever teach you it is rude to stare?" "No one ever taught me anything," he said, "that was worth the learning. I am beginning to think I shall have to learn it all now, from the beginning, from you, and I am 39 and a slow pupil, and it is very galling." She laughed at that. She laughed easily. He had discovered, once a person got past the wall of her wit to the warmth behind it, and he had begun to hoard her laughter the way a poor man hoards coin. "Come and help me then," she said. "Here is your first lesson. Kneel down in the snow beside me, Duke of Pendal, and dig for parsnips with your own 2 hands. And do not think about dignity, because dignity is the most useless possession a person can own, and it has done you nothing but harm your whole life, and I intend to cure you of it if it is the last thing I do." And the Duke of Pendal, who dined off gold and not soiled his own hands with honest work in the whole of his life, knelt down in the snow of a poor woman's kitchen garden in his fine dark coat, and dug for parsnips, and got earth under his nails and snow to the knee and cold to the bone, and laughed, really laughed, the warm astonished laugh that had been locked behind the wall since boyhood, when the first fat pale root came free in his hand, and Marisette declared it the finest specimen she had ever seen, and entirely to his credit, as though he had grown it himself. They knelt together in the white garden under the grey sky, the Duke and the secretary, digging vegetables and arguing cheerfully about whether a man's worth lay in what he was born to or what he made of his hands. And the manservant watching from the kitchen window afterwards swore to the maid that he had seen the Duke of Pendle smile, an actual smile, and that the world was surely ending. Afterward she took him in and made him sit by the kitchen fire while his coat dried in his shirt sleeves, which no servant of his had ever seen, and she made a soup of the parsnips he had dug, and they ate it at the scrubbed kitchen table like two ordinary cold people, and it was, he thought, the best meal of his life, and he had eaten at the tables of princes. Lady Carberry was abed with one of her chills, and there was no one to see, no county to remark, no 7 dead dukes to disapprove, and for the space of an afternoon the man behind the wall came all the way out into the warm kitchen and lived, and it did not kill him, and no one broke his arm. And he began that snowy day over a bowl of parsnip soup to believe that the whole architecture of his fear had been a lie. "Why do you do this?" he asked her over the soup. "Why do you trouble with me at all? You have said yourself I am arrogant and cold and shallow as a saucer. You have nothing to gain by me. You have made very sure, I understand, you will take nothing from me. You might have had your wood and shut your door and never seen me again and been wiser for it. Why do you let me kneel in your garden and sit in your kitchen and eat your soup?" She considered the question seriously, as she considered everything, turning her spoon in the bowl. "Because," she said at last, "I have spent my whole life being overlooked, Your Grace, and I know what it is to be a person no one troubles to see, and I would not wish it on my worst enemy, and you, though you would never believe it, are the most overlooked person I have ever met. Oh, the whole county sees the Duke. They see the coronet and the acres and the cold face and the power. Not one of them has ever once seen the man, because the man will not come out from behind the Duke, and I do not think anyone has ever tried very hard to coax him, because the coronet is frightening and the man is hidden, and it is easier to fear the one than to look for the other. I looked for him. I found him in a lane, admitting he could not keep away and hating himself for it, and I found him in a garden just now, laughing over a parsnip, and I find him worth the trouble, not the Duke, who is tiresome, but the man who is not. That is why. It is the only reason I have, and it is not a very sensible one, and I would be a great deal more comfortable without it, and it appears to be permanent, which is a considerable nuisance." He set down his spoon. The fire cracked. The snow fell soft and silent past the small window, and the kitchen was warm and close and safe, and the Duke of Pendle looked at the grey-eyed woman across the scrubbed table and felt the last of the winter's cold go out of him. "No one," he said, "has ever looked for the man. In 39 years. Not once. You are the first." "Then it is a good thing I am stubborn," said Mariset Wren, "for the man was very well hidden, and has taken a deal of looking, and I am not nearly finished. Now eat your soup, Your Grace, before it goes cold, and stop looking at me as though I had handed you the moon. I only handed you a parsnip. The moon, as I have told you, we share." What happened next was the world. For a little while, in the sheltered hollow of that country winter, the Duke of Pendle had been able to forget that he was the Duke of Pendle, had been able to sit in a shabby morning room and be simply Ransom, a man learning too late how to be a man. But a duke cannot forget himself for long, because the world will not let him, and the world came for him in the 3rd week of a hard frost, in the shape of a letter and a visitor and the whole cold machinery of who he was and what was expected of him. The letter was from his great-aunt, the Dowager Marchioness of Halloway, the fiercest and most powerful of his surviving relations, a woman of 80 who ruled the family from a great house in the north as the Duke ruled the valley, and who had heard for the world is small at the top and gossip travels fastest among the great that her nephew had been seen calling, without pretext and with alarming frequency, upon a penniless nobody in a country grange. Her letter was 3 pages of iron. She reminded him of his name, his blood, his duty, the 7 dukes before him, the entail, the necessity of an heir got upon a woman of suitable rank and fortune. She informed him that she had already, in anticipation of his coming to his senses, half arranged a match for him with Lady Sophronia Bellwether, daughter of an earl, possessed of £30,000 and a lineage nearly as old as his own, that the young lady and her father would be arriving to stay at Pendle Hall within the fortnight, and that she, the dowager, would be arriving with them to see the business properly done. "You are the Duke of Pendle," she wrote in her great slashing hand. "You do not marry secretaries. You have amused yourself in the country. Very well, a man may. But the amusement ends now. Do your duty, or answer to me." The visitor was Lady Sophronia herself, come a week early with her father, a handsome cold girl of 22 who had been bred for exactly this from the cradle, and wanted the Duke's coronet with a want as chill and total as any the Duke himself had ever felt. She was beautiful in the hard, bright way of a diamond, and accomplished, and perfectly correct, and she looked at the Duke of Pendale with a proprietary calm that told him she considered the matter already settled. And she looked at the grey cold splendour of Pendale Hall with the eyes of a woman measuring where her own portrait should hang, and the machinery closed around him. This is where the tale might have ended well, and quickly, had the Duke of Pendale been already the man he was becoming, and not still, in his marrow, the man he had been. But a wall 33 years in the building does not come down in a single winter. And when the world pressed on him, when his great-aunt's iron and Sophronia's diamond calm and the whole weight of 7 dead dukes bore down at once, the old man in him rose up to meet it, 'cause the old man knew how to meet such things, and the new man did not. The old man had been forged for exactly this, for rank, for duty, for the cold, correct arrangement of a great life. The new man had only a shabby room and a woman's hand against his face, and no name yet for what he was, and in the moment of pressure it was the old armour his hand closed on, because it was the armour he had worn all his life, and it fit. He did not throw over Sophronia and ride to the Grange and lay his name at Marisette's feet. He wished, later, that he had. He saw later that the whole of his happiness had hung on his doing it, and that he had failed the test at the worst possible hour, but in the moment, faced with his great-aunt's contempt, which was his father's contempt, wearing an old woman's face, the wall went up again, fast and cold and complete, and behind it the frightened boy who had learned that to want openly was to be broken decided, in a spasm of the old self-protection, that the safe thing, the correct thing, the ducal thing was to do his duty and give up the want. He told himself it was honour. He told himself that Marisette deserved better than to be the ruin of a great name, that she would be scorned as a fortune hunter, that the county that had laughed at their window would savage her as a duchess got out of a grange, that in giving her up he was protecting her. There was even a little truth in it, which is what made the lie so easy to believe, but underneath the honour was the old fear, the fear of his father's cold face and cracking arm, the fear that had taught him that the wanting of a thing was the surest way to lose it and be broken in the losing, and it was the fear, not the honour, that made the decision, though he would not know it for a long and bitter while. He went to the Grange one last time in the failing light of a frozen afternoon, to end it. He did not tell her first that Sophronia had come. He found he could not. He came into the shabby morning room where he had learned to be a man, and Marisette rose to meet him with a warmth in her grey eyes that had not been there in the autumn, a warmth he had put there stone by stone, over a winter of trying, and he stood before it with the wall raised and the cold mask on, and he said the cruellest thing he had ever said. And he said it in his father's voice. "I am to be married," he said, "to Lady Sophronia Bellwether. The arrangements are made. My great-aunt has seen to it. It is a suitable match of rank and fortune, such as a man of my name is bound to make. I came to tell you myself, because you deserved not to hear it from the other house." He heard the coldness in his own voice and hated it, and could not stop it. This winter has been, there is no graceful word for it, an interlude, a pleasant folly. But I am the Duke of Pendale, and you are Lady Carberry's secretary, and there was never, in the plain sense the world understands, any possibility in it, and we were both, I think, wise enough to know so, even when we forgot it by the fire. The warmth went out of her face. He watched it go, the way a man watches a lamp put out in a window he loves, and he told himself he was doing right, and did not believe himself even as he did it. She did not weep. He had half braced for weeping, and there was none. She stood very still in the cold room in her worn grey gown, and she looked at him with her level grey eyes, and when she spoke her voice was quiet and steady, and it cut him worse than any weeping could have done. "So," she said, "there is the wall, gone straight back up. And here is the man I mistook you for after all, standing in my morning room in his father's clothes, telling me that a season of learning to be human was a pleasant folly, because a great-aunt frowned. I ought to have trusted my first judgment of you. I ought never to have revised it." She drew a slow breath. I will not argue with you, Ransom. That is the thing you have always liked best in me. Is it not that I argue, that I meet you, that I do not fear you? I will not do it now. You are not worth the arguing. A man who would build himself back into a coffin the first time the world knocks on the lid is not a man I can reach. And I am done reaching. You have made your choice. You have chosen to be safe. I hope you are very safe indeed. Up there in your cold house with your cold, correct wife and your 7 dead dukes for company, and I hope, on the nights when you cannot sleep, that you remember there was a woman once who loved the man behind the wall and would have crossed any river in the world to be with him. If only he had had the courage to be him. Her voice did not break. It was worse that it did not break. Now go, and do not come again. You gave me a wood once, and it was the best thing you ever did, and I release you from it. Take it back, sell it, burn it, I do not care. I do not want anything of yours, least of all your pity dressed up as honor. Go home, your grace. You know the way, it is the safe road. He went. He rode home through the frozen dusk with her voice in his ears and his father's coldness on his face, and a thing tearing quietly in the country of his chest that he had only lately learned he owned, and he told himself it was done and it was right and he would forget it, and he knew. With the part of him that had never been able to lie to itself for long, that he had just done the most disastrous thing of his life, and that no wall in the world was thick enough to keep out the knowing of it. The house on the hill was full of guests. The dowager had arrived. The great cold rooms blazed with more candles than they had held in years. Lady Sophronia sat at his table in diamonds and made correct conversation and looked at him with her calm proprietary eyes, and the dowager beamed her iron approval, and the whole machinery of his name hummed smoothly along its ancient tracks toward the marriage that would restore the Vales to their proper cold magnificence. He had done his duty. He had done exactly what 7 dead dukes and a living great-aunt required of him. He sat at the head of his own splendid table amid the blaze of candles and the glitter of the woman he was to marry, and he had never in his life been so cold. And behind the wall he had rebuilt swiftly. The man he had spent a winter becoming stood alone in the dark and hammered on the stone, and could not get out and was not heard. The weeks that followed were the worst he had known. He was correct. He was cold. He rode over his lands and gave his orders, and the world obeyed as it always had, and every obedient face reminded him of the one face that had never obeyed and never would, and was lost to him now by his own act. Lady Sophronia was everything the world required and nothing the man behind the wall wanted. Her cleverness was the cleverness of advantage. Her beauty was armor like his own, and when she spoke to him he found himself, God forgive him, listening for a different voice. A low, clear, fearless voice that would tell him precisely what was wrong with him and be right. He had traded the one person who had ever seen him for a woman who never would, and called the trade honor, and the trade grew more unbearable with every correct and candlelit day. The dowager set the wedding for the spring. The banns would be read. The county was told. And the Duke of Pendal, who could command anything, found that he could not command his own heart to be still, and lay awake in the great cold bed of his fathers, nigh after frozen night, with the sound of a hand hammering on stone from the wrong side of a wall he had built with his own 2 hands. The weeks of Lady Sophronia's visit, before the breaking, had a cold glitter to them that the Duke of Pendale would remember with a particular self-disgust for the rest of his life, for they were the last weeks in which he tried, in earnest, to be the man his father had made and to want the things his father had wanted, and he had never been more wretched than in the trying. Lady Sophronia Bellwether was not a cruel woman precisely, though she had a cruelty in her of the sort that comes not from malice, but from a total incuriosity about anyone below her own rank. She swept through Pendale Hall as though she already owned it, which she considered as good as done, and she catalogued its treasures and its acreage and its consequence with the cool precision of an auctioneer, and she was gracious to the Duke and glacial to his servants and unaware that there was any difference between the 2 attitudes worth remarking, because to her the servants were furniture and the Duke was a title and neither was a person. She had been bred exactly as he had been bred, in a great cold house by cold correct people, to marry rank and produce heirs and want nothing that could not be counted. And looking at her the Duke of Pendal saw, with a horror he could not name, his own reflection saw what he had been, what he was meant to be, what a lifetime beside her would make of him again. She was the wall, made flesh, and offered to him as a bride. She came upon him once in the long gallery, where he stood before the portrait of his father. The seventh Duke had been painted stern and magnificent in his robes, and the ninth had inherited the face along with the coldness, and she stood beside him and studied the portrait with her appraising eye. "He has your look," she said, "or you have his, a hard face. It is a good face for a duke, it commands. I hope our sons have it." She said our sons the way she might have said the North Wing, a thing settled and owned and requiring no consultation. "You are fortunate in your blood, your grace. So few families keep the line so pure. My father says the Vales have never once married beneath themselves in 700 years, and I confess I find that a great comfort. There is nothing so vulgar as a mésalliance. One sees it now and again among families that have grown careless, a duke who marries an actress, a marquess who takes up with a governess, and the whole line is poisoned for a generation, the good blood watered down, the consequence thrown away for a pretty face or a passing fancy. I could not respect a man who did such a thing, could you? And the Duke of Pendle, standing before his father's cold portrait beside his correct cold bride, thought of a woman on her knees in the snow digging parsnips, of a low clear voice telling him the moon was hers, of a small warm roughened hand against his cold face by a dying fire, and he understood, in a flash of cold clarity, that everything Sophronia Bellwether valued was everything that had made his life a frozen misery, and everything she despised was everything that had, for one thawing winter, made it worth living. He understood it, and he said nothing, because the war was up and the coward was in command, and he let her go on believing they were of one mind, and he hated himself with a completeness that was almost cleansing. The line, he said, is a great responsibility, which was true, and was cowardice, and satisfied her entirely, and she smiled her cold, correct smile and passed on down the gallery to appraise the next treasure, and left him alone with his father's painted contempt, and he stood there a long time and did not move, and did not weep, because he had not yet learned to. The dowager watched it all from a throne of pillows with her fierce old eyes, and was satisfied, and did not see, for even she was not so wise as she believed that her satisfaction was building a catastrophe. She saw a nephew doing his duty, a suitable match progressing, a great name secured. She did not see a man dying by inches behind a wall, listening every waking hour for a voice that was not at his table, comparing every cold correct word Sophronia spoke to a warmer, sharper, truer word from a shabby grange, and finding the diamond wanting against the parsnip every single time. She had arranged, with the best cold intentions of her whole cold family, the most miserable marriage in England, and she did not know it, and the Duke did not tell her, because the Duke, in those weeks, had gone back behind the wall, and behind the wall a man tells no one anything, not even himself. It could not hold. That was the thing. The wall had never been built to withstand not force, which it turned aside easily, but truth, which seeped in through every crack, patient as water, and swelled, and split the stone. The truth had a grey-eyed face and a low, clear voice, and it told him once, in a muddy lane, that the wall must come down from within or it would not come down at all. And now, in the cold glittering weeks of his courtship of a woman he did not want, the truth worked at him from inside, stone by stone, loosening what his fear had raised, until it wanted only one honest push. Fenwick's turning hat, a shut grange, a father's ghost confronted at last in the dark to bring the whole cold edifice crashing down, and let the man out into the open too late, and not too late, into the cold red dawn of an inn yard where a coach stood waiting with its door open. It was Fenwick of all people who broke the wall for him. Fenwick, the dry, careful steward who had feared him for a decade and had, over the strange thawing winter, begun to speak to his master as a man speaks to a man, because his master had begun, for the first time, to make it safe. He came into the Duke's study on a grey morning in the last of the frost, with a look on his face the Duke had never seen there, and he stood a moment turning his hat in his hands, and then he said, "Your Grace, I have something to say, and I do not know if it is my place to say it. And I have decided I will say it anyway, because if I do not I shall despise myself, and I have spent too many years already despising myself for the things I did not say to the Vales." "Say it," said the Duke. "You are making a mistake," said Fenwick. "The worst mistake I have watched a Vale make. and I have watched them make a great many. You have been a different man this winter, your grace. The whole valley has felt it. The roofs and the rents and the way you speak to us now, as though we were people and not furniture. That was not the old Duke, and it was not nothing, and it did not come from nowhere. It came from her, from Miss Wren. Everyone in the valley knows it, though no one dares say it to your face, and I am saying it to your face because someone must. She made you human, your grace, and you have thrown her over for a marble girl with £30,000, because an old woman in the north frowned at you. And you are turning back into the man you were before our eyes, cold and correct and dead, and it is a waste, and it is a wrong, and it is a coward's choice, and I would rather be turned off without a character for saying so than watch it and hold my tongue. The Duke of Pendale sat very still behind his great desk, and for a long moment the only sound in the cold study was the fire and the wind. He might have destroyed the man. A year before he would have. Fenwick knew it, and had said it anyway, and there was more courage in the dry steward's turning hat than in all the diamonds at the Duke's table. "Why," said the Duke at last, and his voice was low, "does everyone in this valley find the courage to tell me the truth, now at the end, when it is too late?" "Because you made it safe, your grace," said Fenwick simply. "That is the thing you did this winter. You made it safe to tell you the truth. And now you are unmaking it, and we are all watching you unmake it, and the man who made it safe is worth saving. And I do not think he is quite dead yet, or I would not be standing here." He put his hat on. "There is one thing more, and then I have done. Miss Wren is leaving the valley. Lady Carberry's health has failed with the shock of the winter and the disappointment, and they are going to Bath for the waters, and the Grange is to be shut up, and they go the day after tomorrow, on the early coach. I thought you should know it. I do not know why. I have no more business telling you than I had telling you the rest. But there it is. She goes the day after tomorrow, and once she is gone, and Bath is a long way, and a marble girl is a cold thing to grow old beside. Good morning, your grace." And he went out and shut the door, and left the Duke of Pendale alone with the truth at last, and no wall left standing that could keep it out. She goes the day after tomorrow. He did not sleep that night. But it was a different sleeplessness than the frozen weeks before. It was not the hammering of a trapped man on a wall, but the terrible clarity of a man who has stopped at last, defending the wall, and turned, and seen it plain for what it is, a coffin he built himself, a fear he dressed as honor, a lie he told to keep from wanting the one thing worth the wanting. He lay in the great cold bed of his fathers, and he made himself think, all the way through, the thing he had refused to think for 6 weeks, that he loved Marisette Wren, that he had loved her since a window and a moon, that everything good he had become had come from her, and everything he had rebuilt since losing her was the old death dressed up in duty, that a marriage to Sophronia Bellwether would be a cold, correct, lifelong penance for a cowardice he need not have committed, and that his father was dead, had been dead for years, and that the whole architecture of his fear was raised against a man who could no longer break anyone's arm, and that he, Ransomvale, was a grown man of 39 who had let a corpse rule his life from the grave. Weep quietly, his father had said. He wept that night in the great cold bed, and he did not weep quietly, and there was no one to punish him for it, and no one heard, and it was the last stone in the wall, and when it fell the man behind it stood at last in the open, cold and shaking and alive, and knew exactly what he had to do, and knew it might already be too late, and rose to do it anyway, because a thing worth having is worth being too late for, and a man who will not risk the failure does not deserve the winning. He went first in the grey before dawn, and woke his great-aunt. The Dowager Marchioness of Halloway received him in her chamber, propped among her pillows like an old iron queen, and she listened to what he had come to say with her mouth set in a hard line, and when he had finished, when he had told her, plainly and without apology, that he would not marry Lady Sophronia, that he loved a penniless secretary in a country grange, that he was done forever, taking his life's shape from the fear of dead men and the frowns of living ones, that she might disinherit what she could, and cut him, and set the whole family against him. And he would bear it, because he had spent 39 years being the Duke of Pendale, and had been miserable every hour of it, and he intended to spend whatever was left being a man when he had said all of it. The old woman was silent for a long time. Your father, she said at last, was a cruel fool, and I never liked him, and I have watched you become his image these 30 years and said nothing, because I thought there was nothing in you but him. I see I was wrong. She looked at him with her fierce old eyes, and something moved in them that might, in a warmer woman, have been the beginning of respect. I arranged the bellwether match because I thought you a cold thing that wanted only a cold, correct match, and would be content in it as your father was content, which is to say not at all, but quietly. If you are not that thing, if there is a man in you who can love a nobody in a grange and stand in my chamber at dawn and tell me so to my face, and mean it, and dare me to do my worst, then you are more than I thought, and more than your father ever was. And I will not stand against you. She snorted. I will have to manage Sophronia and her fool of a father and the county, and it will be tiresome beyond bearing, and you will owe me for it to the end of my days. But I have buried a husband and 2 sons, and I am 80 years old, Ransom, and I find at the end that I would rather see one Vale happy before I die than 100 of them correct. Go and get your Grange girl. If she is fool enough to have you after what you did, she has more courage than sense, and you had better hold on to her, for you will not find her like again, and neither shall I. She waved a jewelled claw at the window, where the black was greying toward dawn. Go. The early coach, your steward, said, you have not much time. And Ransom, he turned at the door, do not command her. I know you, you will want to command her at the last, because it is what you not. Whatever she is not a thing that comes to heel. Ask. It will taste like ashes in your mouth, and you will do it badly, and it is the only thing that will serve. He rode for the Grange in the grey dawn on his great black horse, alone without a groom, at a pace that would have killed a lesser mount, and the frozen country flew past under the greying sky, and the sun came up red and cold over the black line of the trees, and he was too late. The Grange was shut. The shutters were closed, the door barred, the untidy garden white with the last frost and empty, and the smoke gone from the chimney, and the whole small house that had taught him to be a man stood cold and blind and abandoned in the winter morning. He had missed her. Early coach had gone. He sat his blowing horse in the empty lane, the same lane where she had told him he was following her, where he had first spoken the truth to a living soul, and for a moment the old despair rose to tell him it was finished, that he had earned this emptiness, that a coward gets a cold house and a shut Grange and deserves them both. Then he turned the horse's head toward the town, and the coaching in, and rode. The Bath coach did not leave from the Grange. It left from the Rose and Crown in the town at 7:30. And it was 7:15 when the Duke of Pendle flung his horse into the inn-yard, scattering ostlers and hens, and there, in the cold bustle of the yard, among the piled trunks and the stamping horses and the passengers muffled against the morning, he saw her. She was standing beside a shabby trunk with her aunt on her arm, plainly dressed for travelling, her grey eyes turned toward the coach that would carry her out of the valley and out of his life, and she looked tired, and older than the winter had left her, and she did not see him at first. The whole yard saw him. A duke does not ride bareheaded and alone into a common inn-yard at dawn without the yard falling silent to watch, and it fell silent now, ostlers and passengers and the innkeeper in his apron, all of them still, all of them staring. And into that silence the Duke of Pendle swung down off his horse, crossed the frozen cobbles toward the woman by the trunk, and he was aware of every eye in the county upon him, and for the first time in his life he did not care. She saw him then. She went very still, the way she had gone still in the morning room when he ended it, and her chin came up, and her grey eyes met his across the frozen yard with all the old level fearlessness, and behind the fearlessness he saw, because he had learned at last to see her, a flicker of something guarded and bruised that he had put there, and meant to spend his life mending. Your Grace, she said, cool and even, you are a long way from your marble bride. I am not going to marry Lady Sophronia, he said. A murmur went round the yard. Lady Carberry made a small sound and clutched her niece's arm. Marisette did not move. That is nothing to do with me, she said. It is everything to do with you, said the Duke of Pendle, and I have ridden here through the frost to say so before the whole town, 'cause I said the cruelest thing of my life to you in a shut room where no one could hear, and I will not mend it in a whisper. I will mend it where I broke a thing out loud in the open, and let them all carry it to every breakfast table in the county and be damned to them. He stopped before her, close enough that only she could have heard him had he lowered his voice, and he did not lower it. I told you the winter was a folly. It was not a folly. It was the only true thing that has ever happened to me. I told you there was no possibility in it. The impossibility was never you, it was me. It was the coward in me, the frightened boy who learned that to want a thing openly was to be broken for it, and who threw away the one good thing his life had ever held rather than risk being broken again. My father broke my arm to teach me not to want, and I let a dead man rule me for 30 years, and I nearly let him rule me to the ground. He is dead. The wall is down. I took it down myself, stone by stone, this winter, and you taught me how. And then I built it up again the moment the world frowned, and I have spent 6 weeks behind it in the dark, and I would rather stand out here in the cold and be seen by every soul in this yard than spend 1 more hour safe and dead behind it. The yard was utterly silent. Somewhere a horse blew and stamped. Marisette Wren stood beside her trunk with her aunt on her arm and her grey eyes bright and hard on his face, and she did not fall into his arms, because she was not that woman and he loved her for it. You had all the winter to say this, she said, low. You said the other thing instead. I know it. You let me pack my trunk. You let me shut up the only home I have. You let me stand in this yard at dawn believing I was nothing to you but a pleasant folly. I know it. I have no defense. I was a coward and I hurt you and I have no right to any of this, and I am asking anyway, because a man who will not ask for fear of the answer is the man I have been all my life, and I would rather be refused out loud in front of the whole town than protect myself one more time by never asking at all. And then the Duke of Pendal, before the innkeeper and the ostlers and the muffled passengers and his great-aunt's whole watching world, did the thing his father had beaten out of him and Marisette had taught him back. He knelt. He went down on one knee on the frozen cobbles of a common inn-yard, the 9th Duke of Pendal, bareheaded in the cold red dawn, and he looked up at a penniless clergyman's daughter as though she were the only sovereign in the world he owned. I am not commanding you, he said, and his voice was not quite steady, and he let it not be. I have commanded all my life, and it is the only language I was ever taught, and it is worth nothing here, so I am asking. Marisette Wren, I love you. I have loved you since you told me the moon was yours, and I could not stop wanting to stand at your window. I have been a fool and a coward, and I do not deserve you, and I am asking anyway. Do not get on the coach. Marry me. Not a duke, I have been a duke my whole life, and it made me miserable and cruel. Marry the man you made. I will spend the rest of my life earning what I threw away, and there is no guarantee I will earn it, and you owe me nothing, and I am on my knees in the frost asking you to take the risk of me. Will you have me? For a long moment, the longest of his life, Marisette Wren looked down at the kneeling duke, and the whole yard held its breath, and the cold red sun climbed over the roofs, and her aunt wept openly, and the coach that would have carried her away stood waiting with its door open. And then Marisette Wren began very quietly to laugh, not cruelly, not in triumph, but with a warmth that broke over her tired face like the sunrise breaking over the frozen roofs, and her grey eyes filled and spilled, and she was laughing and weeping at once. And she reached down and took the kneeling duke's cold face in both her warm hands the way she had taken it once by a low fire in a shabby room. You impossible, arrogant, wall-building man, she said, and her voice was rough with tears and laughing. You gave me a wood, and then you gave me your worst, and now you kneel in the mud in front of the whole town, and give me the best thing I have ever seen a man do, and you expect me to choose between the coach and you as though it were a difficult sum. Of course I will have you ransom. I have loved you since the window too, and been furious about it the whole time, and I will very likely go on being furious about it for the next 50 years, and I would not undo 1 hour of it. She drew a shaking breath. Now get up off that cold ground before you take a chill. Tell that coachman to take my trunk down, because I am not going to Bath, and I never wanted the waters, and my aunt only wanted a reason to leave a place that had disappointed her, and I intend to disappoint her a great deal more agreeably by making her the aunt of a duchess. The yard erupted. He never afterward remembered clearly the moments just after the cheer that went up from ostlers and passengers, the innkeeper roaring for ale on the house, Lady Carberry half fainting with joy against a mounting block, 'cause the whole of his attention was on Marisette. On getting up off the frozen cobbles and taking her small warm roughened hands in his cold ones, on the fact, too large to hold, that she had said yes, that the coach would leave without her, that the empty grange and the cold house and the marble bride and the 7 dead dukes had all, in a single laughing tearful moment in a common inn-yard, been defeated by a woman who told the truth, and a man who had finally learned to ask. They were married in the spring, in the small stone church of the valley, and not in the great cold cathedral where 7 veils lay buried. For the new Duchess of Pendal said she would as soon be married in a place that had known joy, and the valley church had known a great deal more of it than the cathedral ever had. The Dowager Marchioness of Halloway came south for the wedding and sat in the front pew like an old Iron Queen and wept to her own vast disgust, and afterward declared the bride to be the most impertinent creature she had ever met, and the only person alive besides herself with the sense to manage ransom, and demanded that they name their first daughter after her, which in time they did. Lady Sophronia Bellwether, managed with more grace than she deserved, married a viscount within the year and was, by all accounts, coldly content, which was all she had ever wanted. And Fenwick the steward stood at the back of the church in his good coat and watched his master marry the woman who had made him human, and thought that he had never, in 30 years of veils, done a better morning's work than the morning he put his hat on and told the truth. The valley was slow to believe it, and then it believed it utterly, for the change in the Duke of Pendale was not a wedding's brief warmth but a lasting thing. The roofs stayed mended, the rent stayed fair. The cold house on the hill filled, over the years, with light and noise and the small chaos of a family, and the long galleries where a frightened boy learned to weep quietly rang instead with the sound of children who had never once been taught that wanting was dangerous and never would be. The Duke grew older and greyer and gentler, and the county that had feared him learned to like him, which surprised them more than the marriage had, and through all of it, at the centre of it, was the grey-eyed woman who had refused to move from a window, who argued with him still over books and estates and the beauty of the moon, who never once in 50 years let him command her, and never once in 50 years let him doubt that she loved him. Sometimes, on clear nights, when the house was quiet and the children sleeping, the Duke and Duchess of Pendale would stand together at one of the tall windows of the great house on the hill, and look out at the moon above the black line of the trees. And he would remember a crowded assembly a lifetime before, and a woman in grey silk who would not stand aside, and he would think how nearly he had ridden past the window, and lost the only true thing his life had ever held, how a whole existence of cold command had been undone and remade, and saved by a single sentence spoken without fear. The moon, he would say, drawing her close in the dark, is the same size in both windows. You told me so once, and I did not believe you, and I have never been so glad to be wrong my life. And Marisette would lean her head against his shoulder and look at the moon that was hers, and had always been hers, and was now, she supposed, a little bit his as well. I am usually right, she would say. You would do well to remember it, your grace. And in the dark, where no one could see and no one would ever punish him for it, the Duke of Pendale would smile and hold her and want, openly and without fear, the only thing he had ever truly wanted, and have it, and know at last that he was not safe, and not cold, and not alone, but something far better than any of them, which was simply loved and seen and home. The years were kind to them in the way that years are kind to people who have paid the full price for their happiness and know to the farthing what it cost. The great house on the hill changed slowly, and then all at once the way a frozen river breaks. The new Duchess of Pendal did not sweep through it like Sophronia Bellwether cataloguing treasures. She went through it like light through a house long shuttered, opening what had been closed, warming what had been cold, and asking everywhere she went the one question no Duchess of Pendal had ever thought to ask, which was the names of the people who kept it. She learned them all. She learned the names of the scullery maids and the under-gardeners and the boy who cleaned the boots. And she learned their troubles too, and mended what could be mended, and the servants who had feared the old Duke came within a year to love the new one, and to love, through her, the man she had made of him, for they saw the change in him daily, saw the cold face learn to smile, saw the man who had frozen 3 counties kneel in the nursery on the floor his father's contempt had once made a battleground, and play at horses with children who shrieked with a joy no veil child had been permitted in 200 years. He was not all at once a perfect man. The wall had been too long in the building for that, and there were days in the early years when the old coldness rose in him unbidden, when a servant's mistake or a tenant's insolence woke the ghost of the 9th Duke and the frost crept back into his voice. But on those days there was a low, clear voice at his side that had never once feared him and never would, that would look at him with level grey eyes and say quietly, "There is the wall, Ransom. Do you feel it? Take it down." And he would feel it, and marvelling still that he could, he would take it down a stone, a word, a breath, and come back into the warm, and be forgiven, not because he was a duke, but because he was a man who was trying, and she had told him once that trying was the whole of it, that no one is asked to be born good, but only to labour toward it, and that the labour, freely undertaken, was worth more than any effortless virtue inherited with a name. They had 3 children in the fullness of time, 2 boys, and lost. The girl they named for the dowager, who lived to hold her namesake and to declare, with her last breath and her fiercest scowl, that the child had the family look and the mother's impertinence and would give somebody a great deal of trouble one day, which she said as the highest compliment in her power, and meant it so. The children grew up in a house that rang with argument and laughter both, for their mother would no more raise a child to obey without thinking than she had let their father command her. And the long galleries where a frightened boy had once learned to weep quietly heard, instead, the sound of small voices disputing everything under heaven, and being answered, and being heard. And the Duke of Pendle, watching his children argue fearlessly with their father across a warm dinner table, would sometimes have to set down his glass and turn his face to the window a moment, for the thing was almost too much to bear that they were not afraid of him, that they had never once in their whole small lives had a reason to be, that the chain his father had forged and his father before him, the cold inheritance of fear passed down the Vale line like the hard face and the acres, had been broken at last, broken by a woman in grey silk who would not stand aside from a window, and that his children would grow up free of it, and their children after them, and that this was her doing, and the finest thing that had ever been done in the 200 cold years of the house on the hill. He told her so, once, when they were both grey and the children grown and the house quiet again in a different way, a peaceful way, a way it had never known before her. They were at the tall window, as they so often were, with the moon above the black line of the trees. "You broke the chain," he said. "Do you know that? 200 years of Vale men breaking their sons the way their fathers broke them. Cold begetting cold, world without end, and you ended it. With a sentence about a window, you could not have known that first night what you were beginning." "I did not mean to begin anything," said Marisette, the Duchess of Pendle, leaning warm against his side in the dark. "I only wanted my window, and I was not going to be turned out of it by an arrogant man, however grand. I have told you before, Ransom, I am usually right, and I usually get my way, and it has been the great good fortune of your life that the day we met, the thing I was determined to have happened to be that window, which I got, and the thing I'd not the least intention of wanting happened to be you, which I got as well, entirely against my better judgment, and have never once regretted, though I reserve the right to go on complaining of it for as long as we both shall live." He laughed then, low in the dark, the warm, astonished laugh she had unlocked in a snowy garden a lifetime before, and drew her closer, and looked out at the moon that was hers and had always been hers and was, now, after all these years, a little bit his as well. And the cold house on the hill was warm around them, and full of the sleeping breath of children who had never once been taught to fear, and the 9th Duke of Pendle, who had wanted nothing for 30 years because wanting was danger, stood at his window and wanted only this, exactly this, forever, and had it, and knew he had it, and was not afraid.